Hey there everybody, in this video I'm going to take a look at the Specialized Diverge with extra boing in the front. Just kidding, it's pronounced Diverge. Find out what I like and dislike about the bike in this video. Welcome back Pathless Peddlers, and if you're new to the channel, if you are into the supple life, gravel bikes, bike touring, bike fishing, all the wacky and fun stuff about bike culture, consider subscribing. You have found your people. Before I jump into the review, I want to say thank you to the viewer that sent us cash to buy a new digital scale. That's right, these bike reviews are going to have way more accurate weight measurements. No longer just standing on the bathroom scale. And another thing about these reviews, all these reviews are independent. I'm not getting paid by Specialized. If you buy a Diverge or not, it doesn't affect me financially. And this is really made possible by you guys donating to the channel. It allows me to do these reviews without getting ad money from the same brands I'm reviewing. Does that make sense? So on to the Diverge, let's jump right in. It is a all carbon frame and fork. And in terms of the Specialized bike line, it is their sportier gravel bike, a little bit quicker than the Sequoia. This version is a men's and it comes in this nice gray color, and it retails complete bike for around $2,100. That is the MSRP. So working from front to back, it ships with 700 by 38 millimeter tires and has the clearance for up to a 700 by 42. It's got TRP disc brake. Interestingly, the fork has the ability to run front lowriders. The shifters are Tiagra, not super fancy, but works great. Actually, I like these shifters. This size 52 comes with a 90 millimeter stem, and the fit is pretty much bang on perfect for me. I'm 5'8" with a 29-inch inseam, so hopefully that gives you a frame of reference in terms of sizing. The frame has mounts for 3 bottle cages, as well as a 3-pack mount on the seat tube, designed for some specialized bag. The crankset is Praxis, and it's a really reasonable 48 by 32. I love that they did not go with a standard road double on a gravel / adventure bike. That just annoys the heck out of me when brands do that. The rear cassette is 1134. So we got actually a fair amount of climbing gears, particularly unloaded. I think if I were to take this on a bike packing style trip, I might swap out the rear cassette for a 36, just for that extra climbing gear when things get really steep and loose. And of course, the Future Shock headstem front suspension system. More on this a little bit later. So how does the bike ride? In terms of big broad strokes, I really love the geometry. The rear end is nice and tight. The chainstay length on this size is 419, and when you combine that with the stiff carbon frame, it makes for a fun zippy ride in the rear. It climbs like a dream, especially out of the saddle. The bike just wants to get up and go. In terms of the front end handling, it's nice and stable without being boring. It doesn't get squirrely on the rough stuff, and generally just the front and the rear, it's well balanced and it's a nice design. Super stoked on the geometry. For me, it really fulfills that tucked and slack kind of ideal that I love in bike. The bike came with 700 by 38s, and it only has clearances up to 42. And I think for most people, this is going to be okay. In particular, if you're coming from the road world where 28 is like massive, you won't know what to do with yourself with a 42 millimeter tire. If you come from the touring mountain bike space or are a connoisseur of the modern gravel bike, 42 is going to be a little bit limiting. For me personally, I like gravel bikes that have a clearance of 45 to 50 millimeter to accommodate those new supple tires that are coming out, like the Soma Cazadero and the new ones by Compass. But like I said, this is all a matter of preference. I'm just one of those weird people that like really big tires. So let's talk about the Future Shock suspension system, what I like and disliked about it. I think it does achieve its mission of smoothing out the road. I've been trying to figure out how to describe it, and the closest thing I can think of is that it rides actually a lot like the Molten. It's a little bit stiffer and less sensitive than the Molten front suspension, but I found it fairly similar. On flat terrain with kind of rough roads, there's always kind of this subtle bob in the front. And going down loose, rough stuff, it really did a great job at sucking up those bumps. For me, it was kind of a strange contrast between what felt like a super stiff frame beneath me and a real compliant front end. My brain had kind of a hard time reconciling the two when I first hopped on the bike, but as I rode it, I became more accustomed to it and it just felt a little bit more natural. I should note here that the suspension is tunable. It comes with a couple different springs that you can put in there depending on how compliant you want that front shock. If you're not mechanically inclined and aren't comfortable working on your bike, it's definitely something that maybe your local bike shop should handle. On this test bike, I had them leave in the middle level spring because I figured that's what most people would use and probably not fiddle with it. I found for me, I weigh about 180 pounds, that the front suspension actually felt fairly active, more so than I thought, which is both good and bad. I found when climbing out of the saddle, I really had to kind of adjust my body weight to make sure it wasn't too far forward. Otherwise, the front end would kind of dive and I'd bottom out the suspension. Another instance where I found the suspension a little challenging was when banking the bike into really sharp curves. I feel like it would actuate and the front end would feel a little vague and I didn't have complete confidence in turning the bike over that much. For most gravel events like Dirty Kansas, you're never really making those maneuvers. It's usually a wide sweeping turn or a right angle turn at an intersection. So I think most of the time, if you're riding gravel and aren't trying to rail paved descents, then it won't be an issue. But for me, it was slightly disconcerting. One thing I found kind of strange about the Future Shock is this weird, I don't know what to call it, like a stem cap or fairing. I think that's there to protect the shock mechanism, but seems like a really good place for dirt to collect, mud to collect, and scratch up that part of the frame. Overall, I think the Future Shock does actually achieve its goal in smoothing out the bumps, and lots of people will enjoy it. But there will be some that will think it's weird, and I'm kind of on the fence. I mean, I like how it felt, but at the same time, there are instances where it didn't work for me. So it's really up to preference in terms of ride feel and how much complexity you want to have on your bike to achieve that suppleness. So at the end of the day, for me, the way I would describe the Specialized Diverge is that it's kind of a road cyclist gravel bike. While there are supple elements like the Future Shock and the wider tires, I was still really cognizant of how stiff the frame was. You know, it was super snappy and responsive in the rear, which I loved, but it didn't have that innate compliance you get in the frame materials in a bike, say like the Ritchie Outback. So to me, it feels like a carbon endurance road bike with bigger clearance and some other supple bits tagged onto it. Does that make sense? I think if you're a road biker, you will love this bike. It will feel like home. I think it would make a great gravel race bike, especially for something like Dirty Kansas where there aren't any super sharp corners and you're pretty much just going straight and hammering away. So again, I want to state that these are my preferences. Testing bikes, it's highly subjective. And often changes between the bikes you've ridden in the past, the most recent bike you've ridden, and is really dependent on your wants and needs and abilities and just what you prefer in a bike. So if you like this independent bike review, consider supporting the channel. Check out the links below. And until next time, keep the supple side down.